I'm very pleased to introduce Cara Gibbons. Cara will be our speaker this afternoon, and she's a director of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada. She is Lawyers' Rights Watch's Mexico monitor. She regularly conducts actions in support of lawyers and human rights defenders in Mexico who are threatened as a result of their work. She does report and letter drafting, in-country investigation, and submissions to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the United Nations Human Rights Council. In 2010, she received a fellowship for her LLM studies on human rights in southern Mexico at the University of Toronto. Cara also works as a lawyer at the City of Toronto, where she has a general civil litigation practice and provides specialized advice related to provincial offenses to Toronto court services. She previously worked at the Uganda Law Society in Kampala, Uganda. So with that, I'd like to introduce Cara Gibbons.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience this afternoon. I'm going to be speaking about, let me just pull it up. This report, which I didn't print copies of because they're 60 pages long and very glossy, and this is my only copy, but a report that was drafted and was launched in the UK House of Lords this past July and will be launched in Canada October the 27th in Ottawa. It's called Recalling the Rule of Law, a report on the protection of human rights defenders in Guerrero and Oaxaca, Mexico. The lawyers' delegation was organized by the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales. That is the international arm of the Bar of England and Wales, and they are primarily concerned with protecting the rights of advocates and judges globally. They do this internationally, and they're also concerned with the protection of the rule of law. They're doing a variety of interesting and valuable work in these areas, and the logistics of the delegation were provided by Peace Brigades International. You may have heard of them. They're an international NGO that promotes nonviolence and human rights by providing protective accompaniment to human rights defenders who are threatened. The delegation came about because Mexican lawyers and human rights organizations asked for a delegation of lawyers to attend in order to bring international attention to the situation that they're facing in Mexico right now. I'd like to start out by offering my thanks both to BHRC and to PBI, and also to Lawyers' Rights Watch for the support of the work. And I'd also like to thank my fellow delegation members, and of course all the people we met with. Oops. The report is available online. You can download it here at this link, or you can also download it from the Lawyers' Rights Watch website at www.lwrc.org. So the purpose of the delegation was to conduct an impartial and independent audit of the human rights situation in Guerrero and Oaxaca, Mexico, which are in particular, we examined access to justice, respect for the rule of law, and the ability of judges and lawyers to exercise their vocation freely. The delegation consisted of 12 lawyers from 4 countries. They're people with varied and interesting professional backgrounds, and they were representing a variety of bar and human rights organizations around the world. We met with government representatives from the Federal Ministry of the Interior, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court of Mexico, the National Commission for Human Rights, and as well as state and municipal officials in Guerrero and Oaxaca. We also met with members of the diplomatic community, the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights in Mexico, local lawyers, human rights defenders, NGOs in Mexico City, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. The delegation and the preparation of its report considered legislation, international treaties, various reports on human rights and judicial reform. The delegation also compiled 12 cases that are demonstrative of the human rights and rule of law issues in Guerrero and Oaxaca right now. Several weeks prior to the delegation, organizers sent letters requesting meetings, And unfortunately, we did not receive replies from either the Ministry of Defense or the Office of the Federal Attorney General. And attempts to make contact with those offices in Mexico were not successful. While the report is not exhaustive, it outlines the major obstacles facing.
You have reached Owen Bird Law Corporation. All operators are currently busy. Please hold, and your call will be handled in priority.
Yeah, just stop. Maybe I'm echoing what everybody's feeling right now. I'm just going to continue. So we're outlining the major obstacles facing that Mexico is facing now in respect of both the rule of law and human rights defenders, and the report also assesses where reforms are required. And these are the participants in the delegation. It's a large and wonderful group of very interesting professionals who are all deeply committed to human rights and the rule of law, and most of these individuals were involved at some level in both either the drafting or the editing of the report. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the context that the report and the Mexican situation with respect to human rights defenders and the rule of law exists in. I'll just say first out that I love Mexico. It's one of my favorite countries. I have some relatives who live there. But like all countries, I think Mexico has faced its share of challenges, and the particular challenges that it faces has affected the human rights situation there that we're seeing today. Mexico had a one-party rule for 71 years until the election of Vicente Fox in 2000 as part of a process of democratization. At the same time, there was significant growth in the Mexican economy, but with an unequal income distribution, particularly with respect to indigenous peoples and people residing in rural areas who generally didn't benefit from economic gains. As well, from the 1960s to the 1980s, there were challenges or perceived challenges to state authority were met with force by the state. This period was known as the Dirty War, and during this period, the Mexican military and police engaged in violent repression that included the arbitrary use of force, arbitrary detention, torture, executions, and forced disappearances. This violence decreased after the early 80s with electoral reforms and the subsequent growth of opposition parties. Vicente Fox's PAN government, Partido Acción Nacional, established a special prosecutor's office to investigate the crimes that were committed during the Dirty War. They published a report that found that three different Mexican presidents during the 20th century included this violence as a part of their official practice. The special prosecutor's office was charged with prosecuting these crimes. But of the 600 cases of forced disappearance and extrajudicial execution, the office only filed charges in 16 cases and obtained indictments in 9, and has been generally considered ineffective. Today, most of the crimes from those days remain unpunished, and what also remains is a general climate of impunity when it comes to human rights violations. I am sure you are also aware of the special challenges posed by the narcotics trade in Mexico, because we've all heard the news reports. In December 2006, when the current President Calderon was elected, he declared a war on drugs, and since then has relied greatly on the Mexican armed forces as opposed to the civilian police in order to combat the narcotics trade. Approximately 28,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence since Calderon's election. This has resulted in an increased military presence, especially in the north and southern areas that are the subject of this report. And it has also caused problems of corruption of officials by drug traffickers. Human rights advocates in Mexico informed the delegation that the war on drugs is often used by officials to justify violations of civil liberties. Indigenous people, in particular indigenous people who organize to advocate for their rights, are particularly vulnerable to human rights abuses committed by military personnel. Mexico is a federation that consists of 31 states and 1 federal district. The Constitution is the supreme law of all national laws, but international treaties are considered hierarchically above national law, according to Article 133 of the Constitution, which is something that you see often in civilian legal systems such as Mexico. Mexico has a variety of human rights legislation and has human rights commissions at each state and nationally. On the international stage, Mexico is actually a world leader of human rights. It works very hard to promote human rights in international fora. It's signed all the applicable human rights treaties and works quite hard internationally to encourage other states to do so. It's done quite a lot of good work in terms of strengthening norms and as well as promoting new treaties like the United Nations Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Forced Disappearance. It's been very active as well in promoting human rights at the Organization of American States, and it accepts the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and generally accepts its recommendations. It's also been very open to international scrutiny, for example, by inviting the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights to set up a permanent mission in Mexico City. In 2009, Mexico was subjected to the United Nations Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review, which happens to all UN members every 4 years. Many recommendations related to Mexico related to the reform of the criminal and military justice systems, and these were the only areas where Mexico did not accept the recommendation. I'm just gonna get some water. Another interesting part of Mexico's background is it's one of the only countries in Latin America that has never been subjected to a military coup. And this stability was created by a very long history of the government providing the military with a distinct sphere of influence and generally not getting involved with actions that come within that sphere. And this probably accounts for some of the reluctance within on the part of the Mexican authorities to address criticisms of the military justice system. And you can see that reform in this area is a highly political and highly sensitive issue. I'd also like to mention very briefly a little bit about Indigenous peoples. I don't have the time or the expertise to go into a long history. However, there is an extensive colonial history that includes violence and repression since colonization of Mexico by Spain in the 16th century. Today, there are approximately 10 million Indigenous people residing in Mexico, which constitutes about 10% of the population. Almost 90% of those people are living in poverty, compared to less than 50% of the non-Indigenous population. Because of this long history of poverty and marginalization, some movements, most notably the Zapatista movement in Chiapas in southern Mexico, arose to demand land reform, autonomy, and collective rights. The government has attempted legal and political reforms to protect Indigenous peoples and their cultures, but these reforms remain symbolic and haven't addressed serious inequalities. Guerrero and Oaxaca are two of the poorest states in Mexico and present particular human rights challenges. There's a high proportion of Indigenous population, approximately 1/3 of the total population, and there have been struggles over land, the defense of local tradition, culture, and language. Organized crime is also a very serious problem in both states. In Oaxaca, there was a teachers' strike in 2006 that resulted in violence, and the violence and distrust between authorities and civil society organizations led to a period of unrest that has resulted in increased authoritarianism.